Hola. That's the only Spanish I know, sorry. So yeah, I'm from Riversimple. We're a sustainable car company. We're currently working on the development of a hydrogen powered car that's very novel. We think it has the potential to be the most efficient production car in the world. But very importantly, we're seeking to implement that vehicle through a circular business model. And I've been asked to come here today and share our experiences of developing a circular business with a particular focus on mobility, but also with reference to some more general examples. So I've made the kind of headline that I'd like you to take away from my presentation, collaborate or die. It used to be innovate or die. Does anybody recognize this logo? Anybody? Blockbusters. Yeah, so Blockbuster is a classic example of an established business that got disrupted by a competitor with a new business model. And we certainly believe that we're in an era now where, as you've heard a lot today, we need to disrupt business models. And not only does that lead to more innovation, because when you change your business model, the product needs to change. It's another point we really want to make. But also, as you've heard again today, changing a business model leads to the need for fundamentally more collaborative working. So we feel that innovation is no longer enough, and that in the future, it's collaborate or die. I know you've heard a lot today about constraints, but just to set the context, I thought I'd share our own metaphor that we like to use at Riversimple. So for us, resources are becoming scarcer, demand is increasing, and put very simply, I've heard other people say there simply aren't enough fish in the sea sometimes. And what we really need is new business models that work within a new set of constraints that we think are apparent in the 21st century. And linear businesses, instead of working within these constraints, can constantly bump up against them, and their model is in conflict. Now, within the automotive sector, we've seen a very prominent example of this recently with what happened with Volkswagen. I'm sure you've all heard that they were very naughty and cheated on their emissions tests. And they did this because their business model is not aligned with the interests and the constraints of the planet in the 21st century. And we believe that as a business, we need to work within these constraints and make a profit in this changing context. So what do we mean by these new business models? I like to use this graph to explain it very simply. But what we're basically seeking to do is implement a systemic innovation. The innovation can occur at various different levels. At the most basic level, you can look at improving a product. You can look at maybe fundamentally redesigning that product. You can look at a functional innovation, for example, something that delivers the same function in a different way. Or you can look at trying to shift the system. And this really is looking at, I think someone used a phrase earlier today, product service systems or servitization. So what we're really looking at is providing the service that people fundamentally need in a different way that works within these constraints. And it's much more focused on services. It's very difficult because you can't innovate a system on your own. It inevitably it requires lots of different actors and different stakeholders. I feel it's quite apparent. And it's really about providing, so we like to say mobility rather than a vehicle. And we think that's the real challenge for systemic innovation. And it's really hard. There's kind of three dynamics that we see about implementing, or we think will change to implement these new business models that I'd like to cover for you today and that I'd like to highlight to this audience. The first one is changing the relationship with customers, that we think is a key feature of a service-based business model. Instead of the relationship with your customer being transactional, it becomes relational. I think as Nicholas said this morning, all of a sudden your incentive shifts from trying to sell more product to providing as much service with as minimal product as possible. It, in more technical terms, decouples your profit from your material throughput. So in the automotive sector, certainly we feel that this means we're likely to see less of the people of this kind who are obsessed with trying to sell you cars that you don't really need, and instead are going to be interested with providing you with the mobility that you do need in a sustainable way. We feel the kind of second key change in dynamic is how a service model leads you to innovate. A lot of people say to us, okay, you provide a service, it's leasing, how is this really different? And we say, well, if you actually think about it, the service model changes your design incentives. So if you shift to a service model, the product that you provide within that service model should and will change. And when we explain this to people, that's when they get the key difference between a product service system and just simply selling a product. I tried to use a non-automotive example just to provide a bit of diversity, and I'm not sure if people have heard of Fairphone. It's a Dutch company who do mobile phones. They've been referenced again today. Most mobile phones are provided on a service contract. So why aren't mobile phones designed to be made to last a long time, made to be remanufactured or redesigned? And this is exactly what Fairphone are trying to do. So the shift in model leads to a shift in the product that's made. And the third kind of key change in dynamic that we like to highlight, and this is very prominent with the company I used to work for, as I mentioned, was Rolls-Royce. So Rolls-Royce is a pioneer of service-based businesses. They started to do it even as early as the 1960s and 70s. And as a result of that, they started to invest a lot of money in what they termed engine health monitoring. But this is implementing digital and smart technologies that mean that they can understand to a much greater level of detail what's going on in their engines at what time, so that because they're on the hook for providing the servicing for that engine, they know what servicing needs to be done and when, and they can do that in a much more cost-effective manner and hence make more money. And we're not doing this because we feel it's just good for the planet. We do it because this helps us make profit. And I think that's a really good example of that. So focusing this in terms of what we do at Riversimple. So as I said, we're a sustainable car company. We actually have a clear purpose, which is quite ambitious, but we think it's possible to provide mobility at zero cost to the planet. As I said, we've developed a radically efficient fuel cell vehicle that runs on hydrogen, but it's an electric vehicle at its heart. And I suppose the key differentiating factor between Riversimple and all of the car manufacturers in the world is that we never actually want to sell a car. And that's our stated purpose. Our aim is to provide mobility as a service. There will be a fixed total cost of ownership contract that will have a fixed price element and variable price element. We'll lease it to a customer for, say, 1 to 3 years. When the customer doesn't want the car anymore, we get the car back. We can tidy it up a little bit, lease it to another customer, and so on and so forth, till the car comes to the end of its life, which we think is about 15 years. And we think this is at the heart of a circular business model. We retain ownership of the materials, so it becomes in our interest to make sure everything's reused, remanufactured, recycled. But as I said, the aim of the contract is it includes all of the costs associated with operating the vehicle. So that's the insurance, the tyres, the servicing, the maintenance, everything. And the key additional factor within that we think differentiates it from everything else is that we also want to provide the fuel within our service contract. So if you think about it, that really changes the whole dynamic, because all of a sudden, as a business, we profit from efficiency. So we profit from working within that funnel that I showed you earlier, rather than trying to bump against it and trying to use more energy, which is how a traditional business is incentivized. So it changes everything, even though it's such a small thing. And that guides a lot of what we do within the three dynamics that I've laid out to you earlier. So in terms of the relationship with our customers, we're still a young company. We're in the beta phase. We're undertaking market analysis, but we think offering a service effectively provides us the opportunity to completely change the dynamic we have with our customers. We like to think that our customers are joining more of a movement or a community rather than us simply trying to push product on them that in the end they probably realise they don't really want. But a key thing linked to our business model is this gives us the opportunity to look at how people are driving their cars, how we can have fun ways to incentivise efficiency and performance, because as a company, that's how we make more money. In terms of technical innovation, I'd like to emphasise the point, business model leads to a different product. And we're quite lucky as a new company, we can start from a blank sheet of paper. We actually call our car the rasa, which is short for tabula rasa, which I believe comes from Latin for clean slate. So we've actually designed the car up from nothing to suit the business model. So it's the first car that's been designed for a business model. And the founder of the company scoured all the available literature to say, if I want to make a car that's really efficient, how do I do that from a clean sheet of paper? And he looked at the hypercar project that Amory Lovins worked on, and they came up with something called the network electric architecture, which we're seeking to implement on our vehicles, and we're the only car company in the world to do so. And key innovation is it separates the demands that you have for accelerating and going up hills from when you're cruising around. If you think when you drive a car most of the time, you're driving quite slowly, you're actually not using a lot of power or energy from the engine, but the engine in your car has been sized for when you want to go as fast as possible when you're accelerating, for example, to leave a junction or overtake another vehicle. And the amount of time that you're cruising around is actually 80 to 90% of the time you're driving. And the power difference is quite significant, it's about 80%. So that means 80 to 90% of the time that you're driving around in your car, your engine's about 80% bigger than actually it needs to be. And we think this is actually quite absurd. So the whole idea behind the network electric platform is that it separates the two demands. The fuel cell provides what we call the maximum demand, which is when you're cruising around. And we have a bank of capacitors, which are basically like a battery that can store energy and also release energy in very large amounts to provide the acceleration when you need, the energy when you need when you accelerate or go up a hill. And through implementing this powertrain architecture, as well as other innovations like having an electric motor in each wheel, which leads to a lighter platform, we've produced a car that can still do 100 kilometers an hour and get there in 10 seconds, but can do the equivalent of 250 miles per gallon in energy terms. And it uses an 8.5 kilowatt fuel cell, which we think is quite impressive. And in terms of the digital angle, again, leading from our need to make cars very efficient, because that's our business model, we actually use digital and smart technologies to actively manage the energy within our powertrain, so the energy within capacitors and the energy coming out of the fuel cell. So you as the driver and the energy you demand can be provided in a smart way based on effectively how fast the vehicle is going and what altitude it is at. So it's a truly smart car in that the car effectively knows where it is and what the energy demand is likely to be, and using our algorithms we can provide that energy in a predictive way. And we think aligning this technology to our goal is really at the heart of the business model and circular business. Two more things which are probably operating at a slightly high level that we've started working on more recently that I'd like to share. The first is looking at new value networks. So we like to talk about value networks instead of value chains or supply chains. Very early in the development of the company, we realized that if we provide a service to our customers but buy the components that go into the car from our suppliers, there's effectively a disconnect between our incentives and the incentives of the suppliers. So we make more money basically by providing the most amount of service with the least amount of material and car and fuel. However, our fuel cell supplier, for example, still makes more money by selling us more fuel cells. And this is a disconnect and actually limits our opportunities to leverage value from our new business model. So we said, okay, why don't we approach our supply chain and say, we don't want to buy fuel cells from you anymore, we want to lease them. And to our knowledge, I'm sure there are others, we're the only company in the world who are trying to do this. And the challenge is, you can't just change the business model, you've got to adapt the fuel cell or whatever the technology is to meet the new model. So we're now actually starting on a series of programs that very kindly have been partially funded by the UK and Welsh governments to effectively work with our supply chain and adapt the components within the car to a new value network. So we could potentially go all the way down the supply chain. So we've just heard a lot about mining. We are actually looking at models where we can effectively lease the platinum that go into the fuel cell from a mining company and have that flow all the way up our supply chain into the car and then close the loop back to the platinum provider at the end. And for the platinum provider, this is a great opportunity because all of a sudden they don't have to mine platinum to make money. So it's much more sustainable. And they see the value in it as well. So I think this is really exciting development, although this is one of the main things I'm working on in a minute. I'll be honest, it's really hard, but we are breaking down the barriers to it slowly but surely. And the other thing we realized very early on is that a service model really requires a rethink in terms of your organizational objectives. As I said, we're a very purpose-driven company. Our purpose is to provide mobility, zero cost to the planet. And a traditional shareholder business model optimizes or is optimized for and incentivizes short-term profit. Whereas what we really want to incentivize and optimize is long-term value creation within our business model. And we realised that what this really means is that we need a different governance structure. Oops. So instead of the shares in our company being held by just a single group of shareholders who largely provided the capital, they are effectively split between 6 stakeholder groups, each who represent one of the traditional stakeholders within a business. So there's the financial side, which is the investors, and the environment, which are the two normal lobes of a sustainable business. But then there's the social dimension in terms of the staff, who I actually represent, the customers, our suppliers and commercial partners, and the community. And we have representatives who protect and balance all of these interests to make sure that the long-term interests of the company are prioritised over purely looking at finances. Because really, an enlightened financial investor will recognise that by balancing interests in the longer term, everybody wins and they make more money, and that's effectively what we're trying to optimise and create. So just to finish off, so one of my great influences is a chap called Charles Handy, who wrote about something called the second curve, and he said that typically, particularly businesses and economies work in cycles. And he said the challenge for businesses is to identify when one cycle is starting to decay and when the next cycle is starting to increase, and to jump at the point of decay. And I certainly believe that we're at the point where the linear economy is starting to go into decay, and the future is a circular economy. So I'd just like to say that the second curve is upon us, and to realise this, we need to collaborate. So collaborate or die.